If there is one single franchise best at discouraging multiplayer games from releasing with a campaign by royally fumbling up a series of multiplayer games released with campaigns, it's Battlefield. For the past 10 years, DICE has been so bad at taping on a poor man's version of a Call of Duty campaign that they just said, fuck it, last year and outsourced it to a different company. In 2011, the campaign of Battlefield 3 was so unfathomably bad that 3 years ago, a second playthrough of it convinced me to stay up late and make a 30-minute video bemoaning nearly every aspect of its grand failure. Since then, we got the Battlefield 4 campaign, which was a lot more of the same, save a couple vehicle levels that opened things up a bit. That was followed up by Visceral Games' collaborative Battlefield Hardline campaign, which was so fundamentally detached from the multiplayer that it really did feel like it was made by a different company, one who made a campaign that's more unique as a stealth game than anything else. So over the past 5 years, the lesser half of this series has already undergone a dizzying change of settings and styles, attempting to figure out what a single-player Battlefield campaign should be. So now we're doing the light stealth with bombastic shooter mix in a faux World War I setting where everyone's sprinting around at 10 miles an hour with SMGs that have red dot sights. If there's one thing that can be said about DICE's wishy-washy non-commitment to historical accuracy here, it's that closing the distances of modern Battlefield's high damage, high rate of fire gunplay may have unintentionally created the most poignant anti-war mise-en-play message in years, with you getting slapped by this downpour of unexpected one-hit kills. Oh, the humanity, the horror of war. But of course, you're a much harder target in the single player, where the first-person tunnels of their typical Modern Warfare campaign takes at least a few baby steps towards widening its perspective. Starting with a level select screen of multiple little campaigns that steer BF1 further towards the presentation of the multinational campaigns of Call of Duty 1 and 2. Except instead of having a little slideshow and vocal recording introducing us, we get cutscenes. Really, really good cutscenes, with writing that makes every line count, because these little 45 to 60 minute character arc campaigns afford the writers some density. And that's always been a huge problem for game writing. How do you keep things interesting for run times that can extend from 7 hours to 40 hours? Maybe the answer is to just not go for as long. And for two of these war stories in particular, you have a crazy amount of smart writing and character development crammed into very, very small pieces of game. First example, an American retelling stories of the heroic flying aces of the British Royal Flying Corps. Note how the text crawl describes early airplane combat as a gamble before fading into pilots literally gambling over airplanes. As per usual, our main character's personality is conveyed through in-game barks, but what's more refreshing is that introducing who and what he is done super straight and to the point.
My name's Clyde Blackburn.
I'm George Rackham! I'm Wilson, by the way.
I'm Rackham. I'm your guy.
But what always works to give a ton of depth to a character is reinforcing their traits through repetition of action rather than dialogue, particularly actions that metaphorically represent the characters' internal conflicts. Remember how in Metal Gear Solid 3 you had the boss beating Snake up 3 times as the story goes on just to hammer home how subservient to her he's always been? In this story, that emotional struggle demonstrated with physical action is our hero having to deal with people who are trapped and struggling to escape. At first, Blackburn leaves his fellow man trapped for his own personal gain, because at this point in the story he's
just not a very honest person.
The second time, he wrestles a wounded man out of a crash site and carries him over his shoulders through the danger of no man's land, but only after considering it for a good long while. Very heroic, right? Adding to the irony is that this other pilot unknowingly references the first time this situation happened.
Put your cards on the table, Blackburn.
But it's worth mentioning that this chapter of the story is noticeably darker in tone than the others, not just thanks to the nighttime lighting, but also from disembodied screams coming from wreckage, and from a type of combat shifting away from dehumanized explosions in the distance to the blood and gristle of melee killing. It's also worth mentioning that Blackburn rescuing this trapped man happens because he begins to doubt himself and wishes he could be better. The third time, it's Blackburn himself who's trapped. And this is when the story gets ridiculous. Beginning with your plane just kinda hovering off of this boat, because apparently runways don't matter, and ending with your guy crash landing on top of a burning Zeppelin to hijack its guns. This is a ridiculous Platinum Games Bayonetta set piece in World War I clothing. Its blatant absurdity is then openly acknowledged by our narrator, revealing that the third chapter was him clinging to a fantasy of heroism and redemption.
My name's Clyde Blackburn. I'm a pilot. I'm a gambler. And I'm a stand-up kind of guy. I'm a stand-up kind of guy.
But for some reason, a reason that's not fully explained to the viewer, good, we're supposed to be doubting that fact. And this is all hinted at from the very beginning. You had reason to distrust the narrator right off the bat. The ending twist just confirms that you were really being told two stories at once. We were engaging in a deliberate disconnect between player and narrator. On one hand, you have a plucky gambler with a heart of gold coming into the war seeking thrills and heroism. On the other hand, you have a cocky, dishonest asshole who leaves the war as an even worse pile of problems. That's beautiful storytelling, and what's really refreshing is that it's one of the rare bits of video game, maybe outside of Portal, where almost every single line of the main character's speech matters. It's so short, running in at about 50 minutes, that they don't waste a second of this guy's time.
Why does George Rackham, son of the 4th Earl of Windsor, sound like an American? Woo! 4th of July!
The Germans aren't really known for giving up. They did everything they could to catch us.
No, they didn't! You're lying! Why are you lying?
Well, it'll make for one hell of a story.
Second, in the suspiciously good game writing line, are the tank levels, which don't necessarily use a redemption arc so much as they set up a kinda slasher movie setup where this lovable Irish tank crew is picked off one by one. After the fantastical absurdity of the airplane campaign, we have a story that's defined by a tone of much more believability, up until you're facing off on a flat field against like 12 other tanks at the end by yourself at least. Until then, it's much more believable that a tank could take all these hits and deal all this damage on the front lines by sheer luck rather than just a lone pilot, and that believability is reinforced by a constant narrative reminder that the machine really just doesn't work. The player constantly has to stop and repair, lending an on and off pacing to the whole chapter of short vignette levels bookended by what else but really, really good cutscenes. Note how the camera here does as much work to set the tone as the voice actor does.
You have the look of the devil, Townsend. Is that right?
If the setup here is a slasher movie, then I don't know if it's the enemy forces or the tank itself that's the slasher serial killer here. The love-hate relationship these guys share with their machine is complicated, and it turns a simple series of excuses to blow up bad guys into surprisingly effective historical fiction about how shitty tanks used to be. And that's probably because the first 45 minutes or so of this 90-minute chapter has really good direction. It plays really well on what the viewer doesn't see, and also, just like in the plane campaign, it juxtaposes some bizarre video gamey surrealism with the narrative that totally runs with it. Like the part where you play as a pigeon. The setup for this is brilliant. Sad music and slow motion yelling and underwater shell shock noises are signposted tropes that something bad is happening. These guys really don't want to let this pigeon loose, but no one says why. And before you know it, you're playing as the pigeon itself with the sad music still going on. The first time I played this, my entire mind was engulfed with just one word. What? The second time I was going through this, I was really just looking for signs to confirm that I'm not dumb. No one explains why they're so scared of this pigeon. The scene is designed to make your mind race with questions and consider possibilities as it's happening in front of you, thus begging the question, what? Oh, they're blowing themselves up. Keep in mind that up to this point in the game, you've played as characters who have died sooner. You know that these war stories are short and that you can't expect a happy long life out of a lot of the soldiers you'll be piloting, so seeing that lovable Irish tank crew survive the hit ends up creating a genuine feeling of relief here. It's a good setup, a good payoff, it's just good clean drama. I also like how this campaign takes place across one day, bookended by a climax at night where everyone's at their worst, and all we really need to know about a character's internal conflicts represented by metaphorical actions happens after chopping up a stealth level full of Germans. After all that stress, we wake up refreshed and remoralized in the morning, ready to release a whole bottle's worth of tension. And you know what should be really, really satisfying, what would be really good direction, is a ridiculous, loud, bombastic romp in the tank through that same enemy camp that gave you so much trouble by yourself on foot. Which is exactly what happens, but it falls kind of flat. After playing through it the first time, I remembered this scene being a satisfying, vengeful ruckus, but upon replaying it, it was a real slog. Mostly because tank-to-tank combat is just kind of slow and uneventful here, but also because there's no music when... Come on, there's loud, cheerful music rallying your emotions on in the cutscene, but the game itself is dead quiet here. And that's the big problem I have with Battlefield 1 single player. It's that at some point, all its high production values just stop. It's really not consistent, both before and after these two campaigns. It's really sudden. It's super jarring going from here to the Italian campaign, where the story amounts to, I had to blow up this thing, but then they tried to blow up me, so I had to blow up that thing, but then they tried to blow me up again. Matteo, no! I don't understand how this series of levels is even in the same game as these. I guess they had to rush a few war stories out after taking their sweet time on just 2 of them, but this Italy one is just the worst. What in the world even is this? This isn't a gussied up tale by a cocky liar, nor is this given any excuses to be slightly believable. Your guy is in medieval steel plate armor running and gunning a 60-pound machine gun. That's first-person shooter video game combat, and that's a fact of life that this game has a hard time living with. It kinda kills the mood when lines like this
You're Australian. We're impossible to kill.
can be taken literally and not as sarcasm. It's especially jarring in the opening, which I can't help but feel patronized by. Whew, dying in a video game? What'll they think of next? It's a disclaimer completely undermined by the fact that you'll die on a timer via scripted set pieces anyway, no matter how you play. If you're gonna shock me by killing my characters over and over again, first of all, don't spoil that surprise, and secondly, have the actual enemies do it in the game. Don't have an off-screen cutscene explosion do the job for them. The gritty horror music and short lifetimes of your men here make this one of the most blatantly cheesy attempts at garnering an emotional response outside of a David Cage game. I'm serious. While this sappy music and tragic deadlines are flashing by, my guy has killed upwards of 30 German soldiers in 2 minutes. He just killed 2 of them with a shovel. He's sprinting back and forth with a 30-pound Hotchkiss machine gun that he's reloading in like 2 seconds. And this is all used as a set-piece moment to demonstrate what a horrible waste of life war is, and a flashy little historical lesson about the Harlem Hellfighters, who are on the cover of the game. They narrate the level select screen, they fill up the collector's edition statuette, and that's all of them? We just see them die for less than 10 minutes, and that's all the Harlem Hellfighter hoopla the game has to offer? Man, talk about false advertising. This is also just some more deflated expectations, but I was really hoping for a chapter playing from the German side as well, or at least I was really hoping they weren't going to Nazi them all up as screaming maniacs sprinting into your sightlines. I mean, sure, Valiant Hearts had one dastardly evil German general up to no good, but it also had one of your main swappable characters as a German-born Frenchman who was deported and conscripted into the army. There's one scene where, after nearly killing each other, 2 combatants are stuck in a hole and just help each other solve puzzles to get out of there and get home, which evokes one of the most haunting and influential scenes of one of the most influential works of anti-war literature, The Crater in All Quiet on the Western Front, where our narrator faces off against an enemy soldier without either of them really sure if they're supposed to be killing each other. After doing the deed, our narrator feels terrible about it and has to hide there for hours and watch the guy suffer. That book was written by a German veteran about the German experience of the war, which sure is a side of the story you'll never see in a big World War II game, but for World War I, I think it's always an important distinction to make here that the guys unlucky enough to be born on the losing side of these trenches weren't the same kind of racist anti-Semitic weirdos as 2003's favorite video game cannon fodder were. One of the most bitter aspects of this period of history that colors the anti-war media that usually covers it is that there was no easily distillable good versus evil morality behind World War I's causes and motivations. Actually, isn't one of, if not the most valuable lesson learned from World War I that the economic depression for Germany, guaranteed in the Treaty of Versailles, created the power vacuum that the Nazis exploited? I guess the second most important history lesson is that the borders drawn over the former Ottoman Empire led to a century of instability in the Middle East, but hey, at least one of the campaigns is kinda sort of about that. They ticked that box. Which feels weird to say because that campaign also didn't really meet whatever narrative magic was going on in the Big Two from earlier. And even then, a lot of their magic comes from just having really, really good cutscenes. Gameplay in those airplane levels is some simple point and clicking on the bad dots, which still defines the man-to-man infantry combat. I don't like how your plane turns on the X-axis instead of rotating either. It leaves me upside down when I don't want to be, and this is just not how planes fly in the multiplayer. The tank campaign starts off strong with some dense obstacle placement and spawning systems that smoothly move lines of AI infantry back and forth early on, but once the level design flattens out at the train yard full of hard, slow targets, things just slow down way too much to keep me awake. Some music would be nice here, yo. But throughout the whole thing, from beginning to end, these levels don't really feel like an approximation or a translation of the multiplayer into single player. Battlefield's a sandbox, right? So why do none of the campaigns, or even the levels in the campaigns, feel like sandboxes? They're almost set up like they should feel like sandboxes, but without a lot of vehicles to get into or weapons to use, the feeling of freeform fun that defines the multiplayer isn't really there. I still stand by an idea I had 3 years ago. I think they could go somewhere with this, and that is to bring back the hot-swapping soldiers from the Xbox version of Battlefield 2. Boy, 10 years after that and we're back to Battlefield 1. This is weird. Anyways, hear me out here. It wasn't that great of a game, but it had a great idea, where you driver San Francisco'd your way in and out of soldiers and vehicles to either strategically place them where they needed to be to win the match, or just power through the bad artificial intelligence with your own authentic intelligence. But now, so many Battlefield single-player campaigns are just combat tunnels bookended by cutscenes. At least this time, some of the tunnels are a little wider, and some of the cutscenes are really, really good, but honestly, shouldn't we hope for better?